Good day, and I want to say hello to the Stop the War Machine, Save the Planet conference, which I'm very excited about and very excited to be a part of. And today I'm discussing the issue of countering disinformation. There's a number of ways in which the mainstream press perpetuates disinformation, and I'll deal with only one of those today. And the one I'm going to deal with is discussed probably best in the classic book Manufacturing Consent by Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky. And one means of disinformation they talk about in that book is the way in which similar events are covered in the media in different ways based on who is perpetrating the violence that's at issue and who is receiving it. And so, for example, let's take the cases of Colombia and Venezuela. We often hear about Venezuela in the news almost daily, and never good news. It's always bad news. It's about food shortages. It's about various crises there, medical crises, and if there's protests and there's violence on either side, that is covered in depth. And why? Why does that get a lot of coverage? Because Venezuela is considered if not an enemy of the U.S., certainly an adversary. It is certainly a rogue state in the view of the powers that be. Meanwhile, let's look at its neighbor, Colombia. Colombia is the #1 ally of the U.S. in South America. And so we would expect, again, based on the Chomsky-Herman analysis, that Colombia, that its crimes or its violence, political violence in particular, are not covered much at all. And in fact, that is the case. We rarely hear about Colombia in the news at all, and rarely about the ongoing political violence in that country. The FARC, the main guerrilla group, and the government signed a peace agreement about a year and a half ago, and since that time, paramilitary death squad violence has only increased against labor leaders, human rights leaders, indigenous leaders, Afro-Colombians. And yet, how much press is given to this on a daily basis? Very little, if any. Again, judging by my main source of mainstream news, NPR, I would say I'd never hear about Colombia. Though again, get a healthy dose of things happening in Venezuela. One thing, for example, the press talks about a lot in terms of Venezuela is people who are refugees leaving Venezuela because of the problems there into Colombia. And that's given a lot of coverage. That's given proof that there is a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. While it is true that there have been thousands of people crossing from Venezuela into Colombia, first of all, we have to start with the fact that there are 6 million Colombians living in Venezuela. People who fled Colombia because of the violence there into Venezuela over the years. 6 million out of a population of 31 million. And by the way, these people largely have full rights, get social programs, get health care, etc. And by the way, most of the people leaving Venezuela right now into Colombia are Colombians. That is, people who already fled Colombia into Venezuela. Again, we're given very little context in terms of that. We're only given one side of the story about the flow of refugees in one direction when it's in fact been greater in the other direction into Venezuela. And so here we see how the propaganda system works so well. We have in Venezuela those who are victimized either by want and need or violence. They are worthy victims, in the words of Herman and Chomsky. They deserve a lot of attention because they are being victimized by a state that the U.S. Doesn't like and frankly would like regime change in. Meanwhile, Colombia, whose human rights is much worse than Venezuela, whose outflow of refugees is much greater than Venezuela, is barely covered at all. Meanwhile, I didn't even mention the fact that Colombia has almost 8 million internally displaced people. And so in addition to the 6 million that have fled to Venezuela, you have 8 million or nearly 8 million people who are refugees within their own country. This is second only to Syria in the world in terms of internally displaced peoples, IDPs. Most of these, or a disproportionate number, are indigenous people, Afro-Colombians. And again, when was the last time you heard about that? And again, the reason you don't is those people are unworthy victims. They are victims of a state the U.S. supports, a military the U.S. supports, death squads that the U.S. actually helped create in 1962. And so we hear very little about that. And so, at least from my vantage point, and again, using this analysis by Herman and Chomsky to counter disinformation, one has to reverse that, and one has to point out this disparity in coverage, and to really focus in a lot more on conflicts in countries like Colombia that, one, have huge human rights problems, but two, where we could actually do something because our country is so heavily involved there, so that we could influence our country to take a different course. So from that perspective, it actually deserves possibly more coverage than, say, Venezuela. And so I think to counter the disinformation, we're responsible for covering those uncovered conflicts in the world. To name a couple more quickly, you have the Congo, which is barely ever mentioned. The Congo has had 6 million people killed in a conflict there since 1994. 6 million people. You're talking a Holocaust with a number of people killed. There's been mass rapes of girls, women. And again, when is this covered in the press? Hardly ever. And again, why? Because this is a problem largely made in America. The Clintons supported Rwanda's invasion into the Congo in the mid-90s, which precipitated this crisis. The U.S. knocked off, and then the person who was president before the current one, Laurent Kabila, and put in his son Joseph Kabila, and so who's very corrupt and allows for this penetration of the Congo by Rwanda and another U.S. ally, Uganda. And so again, you see that these are unworthy victims in the analysis of people like Chomsky and Herman. And again, it's our job to call attention to those people and to conflicts like that. Finally, Yemen would be another one. There will be millions of people who are going to die in the conflict in Yemen. And again, this does not get the coverage it deserves, and certainly the fact that the U.S. is supporting the Saudi assault on that country in very real ways is hardly ever covered either. And again, why? Because that is a conflict largely made in America and therefore not worthy of discussion as things go very, very wrong in that country. That is the gist of my message, and I hope that is helpful. Go read Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman.